You hopeless woman. I'm going to take full custody of my grandson from you soon, and I don't even know why my son married you in the first place.
Mom, are you sure this is gonna work?
Son, trust your mama on.
For 8 months, one house in Fairview, Ohio, kept its garage light on until 2 in the morning, every single night, without fail. The neighbors on that street could set their watches by it. They whispered about it over coffee. They speculated about it at the grocery store, and more than one of them lay awake, wondering what a young mother, with a toddler upstairs, could possibly be doing behind a closed garage door long after the rest of the town had gone quiet. What none of them knew, not her ex-husband, not her own mother-in-law, not even her sister, was that the answer to that question was about to walk into a courtroom and end a custody fight before it ever really began. This is the story of Odessa Vance, and the 8 months that changed everything her family thought they knew about her. Odessa Vance was 29 years old, a waitress at a diner on Main Street, and the mother of a 2-year-old boy named Asa. 8 months before that garage light first caught anyone's attention, her husband Roscoe had packed a bag and left, and Odessa had been raising their son alone ever since. What was she really doing every night after Asa fell asleep? Why did Roscoe, a man who had barely called to check on his son in months, suddenly start showing up asking for more time with him? And what exactly had Roscoe's mother, Verlene, already set into motion behind the scenes, certain that whatever Odessa was hiding would prove she was unfit to raise her own child? Before we get into that, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Odessa and Roscoe had married young, the kind of young where everyone in Fairview said they were sweet together, without really asking whether they were ready. Roscoe sold cars at the dealership off Route 9, charming enough to move units on a slow Tuesday, but restless in a way that never quite settled once the newness of married life wore off. When Asa was born, Odessa assumed fatherhood would give Roscoe the anchor he seemed to be missing. For a while it did. He came home on time, he held his son at night, and Odessa let herself believe the restlessness was behind him. It wasn't. 6 months after Asa's first birthday, Roscoe told her he needed space, packed 2 suitcases, and moved into an apartment across town, without much more explanation than that. Odessa did not beg him to stay. She had already spent a year watching him drift, and some part of her had been bracing for this moment longer than she wanted to admit. What made the separation harder than it needed to be was Roscoe's mother, Verlene. Verlene had never fully warmed to Odessa, a woman she often described to her friends as sweet enough, but not quite what she pictured for her son. After Roscoe left, that reluctant tolerance curdled into something closer to blame. In Verlene's version of events, a good wife would have kept her son from wandering in the first place, and so the failure of the marriage became, in her mind, largely Odessa's to carry. She started calling Odessa less, and stopping by unannounced more, always with a comment about how tired Odessa looked, or how quiet the house seemed, each one landing less like concern and more like an inspection. Odessa's younger sister, Junia, tried to help in the practical ways she could, watching Asa on the nights Odessa picked up extra shifts, dropping off groceries when money was especially tight. But even Junia, who loved her sister fiercely, harbored a quiet worry that Odessa was in over her head. She had watched Odessa go from a woman with dreams of running her own small business someday to a woman who came home from double shifts, too exhausted to do anything but collapse onto the couch. Junia never said this doubt out loud in those early months, but it sat there between them at family dinners, unspoken and heavy, the kind of worry that changes how a person looks at someone they love. It was in the middle of that hard, quiet stretch that Odessa found herself cleaning out the garage on a Saturday afternoon, mostly to have something to do with her hands. Tucked behind boxes of old holiday decorations, she found a set of woodworking tools that had belonged to her grandfather, a man who had spent 40 years restoring furniture out of a shed behind his own house before he passed. Odessa had loved watching him work as a little girl. The smell of varnish and sawdust, the way a battered old dresser could come out the other side, looking like something from a magazine. She hadn't touched those tools in over a decade. That Saturday, for no reason she could fully explain even to herself, she pulled a rusted dresser out of the corner, ran her hand along its scarred top, and decided to see if she remembered anything her grandfather had taught her. Nobody in Fairview thought twice about it that first week. Furniture in a garage was nothing unusual, and Odessa said nothing to anyone about what she was doing, partly because she wasn't sure it would amount to anything, and partly because some instinct told her to keep this one thing to herself. After Asa was tucked into bed each night around 8, she would slip out to the garage, close the door most of the way, and work under a single hanging bulb until her arms ached and her eyes burned. She told herself it was just a hobby, a way to fill the hours she used to spend worrying about Roscoe. She had no idea yet that it would become anything more than that. It was Marva Wallace, 2 houses down, who noticed first. Marva was the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's schedule better than they did, and she mentioned to another woman on the street, almost in passing, that Odessa's garage light seemed to stay on awfully late these days. It was an offhand comment, the sort of thing said without much weight behind it, but in a town as small as Fairview, an offhand comment rarely stays small for long, and this one was about to travel a lot farther than Marva ever intended. The first piece Odessa restored was an ugly little side table with a cracked leg and water stains bleeding through the finish, the kind of thing most people would have hauled straight to the curb. She sanded it down over 3 nights, her hands unsteady with tools she hadn't picked up in years, and when she finally applied the stain and stepped back to look at it under the garage bulb, something in her chest loosened for the first time in months. It wasn't perfect. The leg still wobbled slightly if you leaned on it the wrong way, but it looked like something someone might actually want, and that small, private victory felt bigger than it probably should have. She listed it online for $40, mostly out of curiosity, expecting nothing. 2 weeks later, it was still sitting there, unsold, and Odessa began to wonder if she had wasted 3 nights of sleep for nothing. Money was already tight, without Roscoe's second income, and every dollar she spent on sandpaper and varnish felt like a small risk she couldn't really afford to take. Her second piece, a chipped bookshelf, sold for even less than she'd hoped, and after covering the cost of materials, she had barely broken even. It would have been easy to stop there, to decide the whole thing had been a foolish distraction from bills that weren't going to pay themselves. Instead, on a night when she couldn't sleep anyway, Odessa found herself scrolling through videos and forum posts from people who restored and resold furniture for a living. And one name kept surfacing in the comment sections, a woman named Loretta Whitfield, who answered questions from strangers with more patience and detail than Odessa expected from someone she would never meet in person. Odessa sent a message asking about pricing, half expecting no reply at all. Loretta wrote back within a day, generous with advice about photographing pieces properly, pricing them for what buyers actually wanted rather than what felt fair for the labor, and finding the kind of pieces that were worth the time to restore in the first place. It was the first real guidance Odessa had received since she'd started, and she took every word of it seriously. Over the following weeks, something in Odessa's approach began to shift. She stopped treating this as a hobby to fill lonely hours, and started treating it like something worth taking seriously. She drove out to estate sales on her one day off, learning to spot good bones under bad finishes, negotiating prices down with a confidence she hadn't known she had. She photographed each finished piece against a clean backdrop she'd built out of an old bedsheet and 2 clamp lights, following Loretta's advice to the letter. Slowly, Sales started to pick up. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough that she began setting the extra money aside instead of spending it. A small stack of bills growing in an envelope tucked inside a coffee can on the highest shelf of the garage. The boxes started arriving more often after that, packing materials and hardware for pieces she planned to restore, shipping supplies for pieces already sold. Odessa kept them stacked along the back wall of the garage, out of view from the small window most passers-by might glance through, more out of habit than any real intention to hide something shameful. She simply hadn't told anyone yet, not because the business was some kind of secret to be protected, but because she wasn't ready to explain herself to people who had already made up their minds about how capable she was of handling her own life. Marva's earlier comment about the garage light had not disappeared, and by this point it had made its way through at least 3 other conversations on the street, each retelling adding a little more shape to the mystery. Some guessed Odessa had taken up drinking alone at night. Others wondered, not always kindly, whether there was a man involved, someone she was seeing that she didn't want anyone to know about. Nobody guessed furniture. It was, in its own strange way, too ordinary an explanation for a rumor that had already grown far more interesting in the retelling than the truth ever was. It was through one of these second-hand conversations that Roscoe first heard about it, from a friend who still lived on Odessa's old street and mentioned, almost as a joke, that people were talking about what Odessa got up to after dark these days. Roscoe had been drifting through his own version of the separation, dating on and off, still not entirely sure what he wanted from his time with Asa beyond the occasional weekend visit that fit around his schedule. But something about hearing that Odessa might be hiding something, whatever it was, lit a different kind of interest in him, one that had less to do with concern for his son and more to do with an old, wounded pride that didn't like the idea of Odessa moving on to anything or anyone without his knowledge. Verlene heard the same rumor within days, filtered through her own circle of friends, and unlike Roscoe, she did not treat it as idle curiosity. She treated it as confirmation of everything she had quietly suspected since the day her son moved out. A woman staying up until 2 in the morning behind a closed garage door, with a toddler asleep upstairs and no explanation offered to anyone, was in Verlene's mind exactly the kind of neglect she had been waiting to catch Odessa in. She drove over on a Tuesday afternoon without calling first, letting herself into the kitchen the way she always had, and asked Odessa directly what exactly she thought she was doing every night while her son slept alone in the house. Odessa, caught off guard and unwilling to explain a business she still wasn't sure would amount to anything, gave Verlene almost nothing to work with. She said she had a project she was working on, that Asa was never alone because she was right there in the garage the whole time, with a monitor running, and that she didn't feel she owed a detailed explanation to someone who had already decided the worst about her. It was not the answer Verlene wanted, and the vagueness of it, rather than reassuring her, only confirmed her suspicion that there was something being hidden. She told Odessa plainly, before she left that afternoon, that she had already spoken with a lawyer about what options existed for a grandmother concerned about a child's living situation. That same week, Roscoe showed up at Odessa's door on a night that wasn't his scheduled visit, asking to take Asa for the weekend, with little warning and even less explanation. When Odessa pushed back, reminding him of the custody arrangement they had already agreed to, Roscoe brought up the rumor directly, asking her outright what she had going on that had the whole street talking. Odessa refused to justify herself to a man who had left without much explanation of his own 8 months earlier, and the conversation ended with Roscoe storming off, more convinced than before that whatever Odessa was hiding gave him grounds to push for more control over their son. Junia found out about all of this secondhand through a tense phone call from Verlene that framed Odessa as reckless and evasive. And for the first time since Roscoe had left, Junia felt a flicker of the same doubt Verlene was so certain of. She loved her sister, but she also remembered how exhausted and stretched thin Odessa had seemed in recent months, and it was not impossible, in Junia's mind, that exhaustion had led her sister toward some kind of coping mechanism she wasn't proud of. When Junia finally asked Odessa about it directly, over coffee at Odessa's kitchen table, Odessa gave her the same guarded answer she had given everyone else, and Junia left that conversation more unsettled than reassured, the first real crack forming in a relationship that had always felt unbreakable before. Odessa's refusal to explain herself was not stubbornness for its own sake. She had built something in that garage that felt entirely hers, the first thing in years that belonged only to her, and not to a marriage, a family expectation, or anyone else's idea of who she should be. Explaining it to people who had already convinced themselves of something worse felt like handing over the one part of her life still untouched by judgment, and some protective instinct in her refused to do that before she was ready. It was a decision made from exhaustion and pride in equal measure, and it would cost her more in the short term than she expected. By the end of that stretch, the tension had settled into something closer to a standoff. Verlene had consulted a lawyer. Roscoe, encouraged by his mother and his own bruised ego, had begun asking pointed questions about filing for a more formal custody arrangement. Junia had grown quieter around her sister, unsure how to bridge a gap that had opened faster than either of them expected. And Odessa, working later into the night than ever to keep up with a growing volume of orders, said nothing to any of them, certain that the truth, when it finally came out, would speak for itself far better than any explanation she could offer now. While the rumors in Fairview grew louder, the numbers in Odessa's coffee can grew steadier, and eventually she moved them into an actual business account at the bank on 4th Street, a decision that felt almost absurdly formal for something that had started as a distraction from grief. Vance and Company Restorations, the name she'd chosen half as a joke and then kept because it felt right, had gone from selling one piece every few weeks to selling 3 or 4, then a full set of dining chairs that brought in more in a single sale than she used to make in 2 weeks of double shifts at the diner. Loretta continued to check in from a distance, offering advice on scaling up without losing the quality that had made the early pieces stand out, and Odessa listened to every word. Gideon Meeks, who had owned the diner on Main Street for over 30 years and watched Odessa grow from a nervous new hire into one of his most reliable waitresses, noticed the toll the late nights were taking on her even without knowing the reason behind them. She came in some mornings with shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there a few months earlier, distracted in a way that wasn't like her, though her work never actually slipped. Gideon, nearing retirement himself, and fond of Odessa in the quiet way of an employer who has watched someone grow up a little on his shift, asked once if everything was all right at home. Odessa told him only that she had a lot going on, and Gideon, sensing she wasn't ready to say more, let the question go without pushing further. Loretta, watching Odessa's numbers climb from her own distant vantage point, began telling her something Odessa wasn't sure she was ready to hear yet, that what she had built in 8 months was no longer a hobby making extra rent money, but a real business, capable of supporting her and Asa entirely on its own if she let it. Odessa had spent so many months treating the whole enterprise as something temporary, a way to survive a hard stretch rather than a real path forward, that hearing it described as something permanent felt almost disorienting. But the ledger didn't lie. What had started with a $40 side table had, over 8 months, grown into a business that had quietly crossed 6 figures in total revenue. Money that existed nowhere in Fairview's version of Odessa's story. It was against this backdrop that Roscoe, frustrated by Odessa's continued refusal to explain herself and encouraged by Verlene's growing certainty that something needed to be done, filed formal paperwork requesting a custody hearing. The filing cited concerns about Odessa's late nights, her secrecy, and what Roscoe's petition vaguely described as a pattern of behavior inconsistent with responsible single parenting. Odessa received the notice on a Thursday afternoon, read it twice at her kitchen table, with Asa napping upstairs, and felt something in her go very still and very clear all at once. She was no longer going to let this stay buried out of pride. Whatever happened next, the truth was going to be part of it. The night before the hearing, Roscoe and Verlene arrived at Odessa's house together, unannounced, the way Verlene had grown accustomed to doing over the past 8 months. Whether they came expecting to catch her mid-collapse, mid-argument with some unnamed man, or simply mid-neglect, they never fully admitted afterward, but there was no mistaking the look on both their faces when Odessa, tired but calm, simply opened the garage door and let them see for themselves what they had spent months speculating about from the outside. Inside sat 6 finished pieces of furniture, carefully wrapped and labeled for shipment the following morning, alongside a workstation organized with a precision that spoke to months of practice rather than a single careless hobby. On the small desk in the corner sat an open ledger, and Verlene, still not fully understanding what she was looking at, picked it up out of habit, more than invitation, and read the total at the bottom of the most recent monthly summary. It was a number neither she nor Roscoe had any framework for associating with the woman they had spent the last 8 months quietly building a case against. Upstairs, a baby monitor sat on a shelf near Odessa's workstation, the small green light steady and constant, exactly where it had been every single night for 8 months. Odessa did not raise her voice or offer a long defense. She simply told them, in a tone flatter and calmer than either of them expected, that this was what she had been doing every night while they built rumors and lawyers' letters out of a light they couldn't explain any other way. Roscoe stood in the doorway of the garage for a long moment, the custody filing he had brought with him suddenly feeling flimsy in a way it hadn't an hour earlier. Verlene, to her credit in that moment, did not immediately apologize, but something in her posture shifted, the certainty that had driven her for months, visibly cracking under the weight of what stood in front of her. She had built an entire narrative around a woman she had decided not to fully see, and the sight of that ledger, that workstation, that steady green monitor light, made the narrative considerably harder to hold on to. Roscoe left that night without the confrontation he had come prepared for, and for the first time since he'd filed the paperwork, he seemed genuinely unsure of what he was actually asking a judge to decide the next morning. The hearing itself lasted less than 20 minutes. Odessa's attorney laid out bank statements, a full year of tax documentation Odessa had kept meticulously without ever expecting to need it in a courtroom, and testimony from Loretta by phone confirming the working relationship they had built over the better part of a year. The judge, reviewing Roscoe's original petition alongside the evidence in front of her, found no pattern of neglect, no risk to Asa's well-being, and no reasonable basis to alter an arrangement that had, by every practical measure, kept a 2-year-old fed, safe, and cared for throughout the entire period in question. The petition was dismissed before lunch. In the months that followed, Odessa did something nobody in Fairview saw coming. Not even Loretta. When Gideon Meeks finally decided it was time to retire from the diner he had run for over 3 decades, Odessa used part of what Vance and Company Restorations had earned to buy it outright, keeping the name and most of the staff, Marva Wallace included, the same neighbor whose offhand comment about a garage light had started the entire rumor 8 months earlier. Marva now worked the morning shift under the woman she had once speculated about over coffee with the neighbors, and if there was ever an uncomfortable conversation between them about it, neither woman spoke of it publicly. Roscoe, watching Odessa's transformation from a distance, reached out more than once, suggesting they try again as a family, framing his interest as being about Asa, but never quite hiding the fact that Odessa's newfound stability had changed how he saw her. Odessa declined every time, calmly and without bitterness, choosing instead to build a steady, independent life with her son, rather than revisit a marriage that had already shown her what it was capable of. Verlene, humbled in a way she never fully articulated out loud, was the one who eventually reached out asking for a real relationship with her grandson, and, cautiously, with the daughter-in-law she had spent 8 months doubting. Odessa did not close the door entirely, but she made clear that trust, this time, would have to be earned back slowly. What stayed with the people of Fairview longest was not the custody hearing or the diner sale, but the simple fact that an entire town had spent 8 months constructing a story about a woman's late nights, without once considering that the truth might be smaller, quieter, and far more admirable than anything they had imagined. Odessa never set out to prove anyone wrong. She had simply kept working, night after night, on something only she believed in, until it was finished enough to speak for itself. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you had lived on that street, if you had seen that same garage light burning at 2 in the morning for 8 months straight, what would you have assumed was happening behind that door? Would you have given Odessa the benefit of the doubt, or would you have found yourself drawn into the same story everyone else in Fairview was so quick to believe? Let us know your honest answer in the comments below. We genuinely want to hear it. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. If this story stayed with you, wait until you hear what happens in the one we're releasing next.